Hello, as you all know, my name is Dr. Maho, a media ethicist, scholar, and teacher. Welcome back to my series of lectures on media ethics. Today, we are going to be looking at how journalists undermine ethics. How journalists undermine ethics in the practice of journalism. We are going to break down the discussion into several parts and take into about 10-15 areas where journalists, are considered to have run foul of ethics, or some of the factors that are responsible for journalists not adhering fully to the ethics of their profession. I'll take them one after the other. One, sensationalism. Journalists run foul of ethics when they sensationalize stories. We know what sensationalism is all about. A journalist picks a story, and the headline that follows that story is not a true reflection of the body of the story. You blow a story out of proportion to give the impression that much more has happened, especially when it comes to headline casting, or to attract, and often journalists do this in order to attract or get the attention of readers. This is wrong and is against the ethics of the profession. You should write your story, but don't sensationalize it and don't blow it out of proportion. I can give several reasons how journalists do this, and even give live examples of how journalists have sensationalized story. But I believe many of us are familiar with this kind of behavior among journalists. The fact is that pay attention to stories, and if the story is not a reflection of the reality that the story is trying to project, know that the story is mere sensationalism on the part of journalists. Then number two, which is close to sensationalism in journalism, is fixation with a single story. In this age and time, you're going to find out also that many times journalists or a media organization, for instance, they go on hammering on a single story and following a single narrative, possibly to satisfy their paymasters. I say paymasters because obviously such stories, when you see a journalist hammering on a particular story day in, day out, week after week, month after month, you look at the story from all angles up to the extent that the story becomes kind of repetitive. The journalist or the media is fixated with that story. It undermines ethics. It means what you are practicing is no longer journalism, but you are out to promote or to destroy an individual by fixating or drawing undue attention to a story you should report and move on. Because we journalists are said to report history in a hurry. So we write our story, we move on. Don't stay on that story until you begin to create the impression that you have a peculiar or a particular interest in that story. Following that is when journalists rely on information sources that are not credible. When a journalist, we say in journalism, we say the source is the story. When your source is as good as your story, when your source is defective, your story is defective. And when a journalist now form the habit or rely on a source that is not credible for the content of his story, it gives a lot, that media house and the journalist, a lot of credibility question. So journalists, in effect, should avoid writing a story from a source that is not credible. Because if a source is giving you information as the body of your story, the first thing you should ask yourself is, what is the motive of that source? If the motive is wrong, then you know that the story, you should question the credibility of the story, because your source may be giving you a story and presenting the story as credible, whereas he's doing it to malign, to destroy, or to satisfy an inner motive beyond just giving you a scoop for a story. So as a journalist, in order not to violate the ethics of your profession, try as much as possible to be sure of the sources of your story, that those sources are credible, or else you run foul of ethics. Then associated with that is the pattern of journalists in attributing their story to anonymous sources. In many of my lectures, I've always questioned why journalists at times who don't want to mention their sources. And of course, we do know that there are occasions where, as a journalist, as a requirement of your ethics, you need to protect your sources. But when you overuse it, it becomes suspicious. I've read stories where a journalist will attribute his story to an anonymous source who doesn't want to be mentioned, who got the story from another anonymous source. It's ridiculous. Anonymous sources should be used sparingly. And the rule of the thumb when it comes to the use of anonymous source is that the source should be credible and the story he is given to you is verifiable and truthful. And that is the required precedent to you not disclosing the source of your information. You cannot say your source is anonymous when the story from that source is faulty, untrue, or outright is untrue and lacks credibility. So anonymous sources should be used sparingly, whereby you use anonymous sources just because you want to give a cover to a false story. It runs against the ethics of the profession. Then following that, which is now number 5, is lack of patriotism. Patriotism is very important as a journalist, because if we are not patriotic in the practice of our profession, who else will be? Journalism occupies a very prime place when it comes to our national ethos, protecting the body politics. And we should be able to, like I always say, journalism comes with enormous powers. And with enormous powers comes enormous responsibility. You should be responsible. So to that extent, you should be patriotic to Nigeria as a country, not to individuals, not to political parties. You should show patriotism always in protecting Nigeria as a country. There are things, we as journalists, we know we deal on the truth. We deal on factual information. But there are truths which is inimical to the well-being of our country. It's not everything you report. It's not everything you talk about or you broadcast. There are instances, even when you know the truth, and you know that by writing about it, by broadcasting it, is inimical to the country as a whole. It's better you don't do it. So patriotism as a journalist is important, especially when it has to do with issues of national security, reporting issues of national security, deployment of troops, performance of our troops. Journalists should be careful in reporting such issues so that you don't seem as if you are denigrating our troops. So patriotism is important, and as journalists, we should show a high level of responsibility and patriotism in our reportage. Then number 6 is conflict of interest. Conflict of interest. Conflict of interest runs deep in journalism practice in Nigeria today, whereby you see many journalists, they just happen in the profession. It's not as if they deliberately wanted to become journalists. Maybe they searched here and there, they couldn't get a job, or they have an interest or a flair for writing and didn't bother to go through journalism school to be properly trained on the ethics of journalism. They now found themselves in the profession. And as a result of that, they really don't understand what it takes to be journalists and the role journalist plays in the society. So conflict of interest comes about when you are not a thoroughbred professional. You are a journalist, but at the same time, you are a public relations practitioner. You are sent to cover an assignment, but instead of going there to do your job, you use it as access to other things. Or you are a journalist, you are doing other things on the sideline. You are not properly a journalist. So conflict of interest comes about when you are supposed to write, go for the story, go for the facts, go for factual information, but rather you are trading information, for personal benefit. That's where conflict of interest comes in. So that on its own undermine ethics in the profession. As journalists, we should be thoroughbred, we should be focused on our profession and not doing side jobs that undermine ethical consideration. Following that, which is now number 7, is what I would call brown envelope syndrome. Brown envelope syndrome is closely associated with conflict of interest. Brown envelope syndrome means as a journalist, you go for an assignment as is prevalent in among many prevalent among many journalists in Nigeria today. You go for an assignment, and after the assignment, you are given what they call honorarium or brown envelope. In many parts of the country, there are several names for it, but the bottom line is that you are giving a reward, you are giving gratification for you to do your job, either in the name of honorarium, like I said, or transport fare to go back to your offices. It's wrong, because this has a tendency of undermining ethics. If you are giving money, gratification, before you write your story, how are you sure that it will not affect your editorial judgment? This is a very big consideration. A lot of people argue against it, some for it, but when it comes to ethics, it is wrong as a professional journalist for you to go for an assignment and you are giving any form of gratification for any reason or under any subhead. It is wrong. You should reject it. It is unacceptable. It's an ethical violation, and it undermines your ability to be editorially independent in the practice of your profession. So these are some of the issues that undermine ethics. We've looked at sensationalism. We've looked at fixation with a single story. We've looked at unreliable information sources. We've looked at attribution to anonymous sources. We've got to look at lack of patriotism. We look at conflict of interest and brown envelope syndrome. I'll stop here for now. In our next episode, we'll continue with some factors, more factors that undermine ethics in journalism. Thank you.